Welcome back after lunch. My name's Rishi Das Gupta, and I'm here to start off our afternoon session where we're focusing on a little bit pivoting to look at the future and developing the future of life sciences. And we thought we would start that off with a panel discussion, and we have a really great panel assembled. I'll let them each introduce themselves, but we'll go Foad, Sheeba, AJ, and Ian will go round. And if you could tell us a little bit about your area of focus and what elements they bring together in basic research, translation, and in commercial partnerships, we can start to weave that together, I think, over the next 30 or 40 minutes. Foad, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you. So I'm Foad Rouhani. I'm a surgeon scientist at King's. I run a lab, a research group at the Francis Crick Institute, and I am a practicing transplant surgeon at King's College Hospital. The focus and the interest of our lab is to look at the mechanisms of liver regeneration and more broadly tissue regeneration, how we can apply those principles to other tissues. Where we sort of sit, because of my sort of links to the hospital, then that gives us a quite unique position in being able to translate some of our findings going forward. But then also, because of where we are at King's and in South London, then there are lots of opportunities for partnerships with commercial companies and so on.
Excellent. Thank you. Sheeba?
I'm Sheeba Irshad. I'm a breast cancer oncologist and also a clinician scientist. I have a leader research group that's specifically interested in looking at how tumor cells and immune cells talk to each other, specifically in groups where we don't have good treatment options for them, so sort of chemotherapy, immunotherapy resistant disease. In terms of kind of where I see we add value is actually, I really think we're a bridge between, I see my patients, I go upstairs and we have a lab where I speak to some of the smartest people to bring the clinical sort of unmet need to them. And there has been a real step change in the way in which we engage with pharma, and sort of going back, I also think as clinician scientists, we play quite an important role in taking back what we see in the labs back to clinics, so it kind of makes a full circle. And before I pass on, just really to say, I think also where we are, actually the diverse patient population that we serve, I think that adds a whole different interesting sort of complexity to the research that we can carry out within KHP. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Firstly, thanks for the invite. Delighted to be here. Feeling a little bit of a blow-in at the minute, but I'm Ayokunmi Ajetunmobi, AJ for short, and I'm the Director of Venture Development at Pioneer Group. For those of you who are unaware, Pioneer is a leading investor in European life science ecosystems. We combine venture building, meaning company creation, acceleration, and investment, with access to lab space, so wet labs, dry labs, GMP facilities, and so on, to support life science startups and spin-outs in driving improved patient outcomes. And I don't know if the news is filtered through yet, but we recently partnered with King's College London to develop 2 new incubators on the South Bank, one by Guy's Hospital, which will have a predominantly biotech focus, and one by St. Thomas's Hospital, which will have a predominantly medtech focus. Just to your question about ecosystems, I think traditionally when we look at driving patient outcomes, we've thought about things from various stakeholders, such as the patients themselves, the clinicians, other allied health professionals, regulators, and so on. But I think in the last decade or so, especially in the UK and across Europe, there's been a greater interest and a greater focus in the role of spin-outs and startups in driving improved patient outcomes, taking research out of the lab, out of academia, and bringing it into the clinic. And that's where we operate, right? It's to sort of create that infrastructure, be that physical infrastructure through the space, be that financial infrastructure through investment, or be that social infrastructure through the ecosystem that you build around. And we're very excited about the impact that can have in improving patient lives.
Awesome. Well, speaking of bringing it out of the lab and into the clinic, Ian, would you like to?
Yeah, well, thanks, Rishi. Great to be here with colleagues. I'm Ian, by background an immunologist and transplant nephrologist, but by a happy, I hope, accident, I'm the Chief Executive of Guy's and St Thomas's, where with our partners within KHP, I think we have a special opportunity. We have I would say, pretty unique collection of academic and clinical and commercial assets in this particular part of a world city. And being a world city is important. If we can bring those ingredients together, ingredients that covers everything from the Genomics Medicine Consortium that we lead, that covers 12 million people across the South, through the data ambitions that we have, taking those tools of the fourth industrial revolution, through our deep commitment to advanced therapeutics, cell and gene regeneration, and our commitment to population health. If we can combine those assets with the creativity of the innovation funding and commercial opportunities. So, for example, we already have KHP Ventures, 16 very carefully selected companies in at the moment. They're all growing. That's unusual in a post-accelerator phase, including raising a venture fund. But if we can partner, importantly, with industrial and commercial colleagues, particularly around some of the unique commercial property developments that clearly are going to be happening on this side of the Thames, we have the opportunity in an innovation district of the South Bank, South Central 1, SC1, to create something that's really special. And if we combine that with the cultural aspects of this world city, but importantly, the population, diverse population that we serve, I'm going to say this is better than Kendall Square. So we might get into that a bit, Rishi, as well.
I think that's a really good place to start off our discussion, actually. And so you brought out several themes there. Why don't we start off with the kind of patient population that we have in South London, the diversity that brings, and how that's related into the work that you're doing. So perhaps Foad or Sheeba, do you want to pick up there to start with?
So the liver unit at King's is the biggest in the UK, probably the biggest in Europe.
I was wondering how long it would take you to say that.
and so we have a sort of fantastic reach, both locally but also regionally, and actually we cover other regions, sort of the southwest and actually Northern Ireland as well. So we do have a real opportunity to really make huge impacts in large proportions of the population, a lot of whom are in deprived areas and in poor socioeconomic conditions as well.
It is a large, I joke about it because it is a fantastic unit, but I guess that brings a set of infrastructure with it that must be attractive to commercial partners as well. Yeah,
very much so. So we not only have sort of the critical mass of clinicians and academics. We have sort of GMP facilities for things like hepatocyte transplantation that is done for the pediatric population. And yes, absolutely, there are a number of very attractive features of the liver unit there.
Okay. And Sheeba, do you want to?
Yeah, I think in terms of this, I think we all recognise that we're sitting on this sort of diverse, we serve a diverse patient population, but I think other people are also recognising that, not just the people that work within it. So I can give two examples pretty much in the last sort of couple of months where AstraZeneca, for example, they've visited King's primarily because they want to do research with us because of the sort of patient population that we may be able to ask those questions. I'm also part of the CRUK sort of grand challenge. We've been shortlisted as one of the sort of, I think I will also say something, out of 144, we've been shortlisted down to 12 to actually sort of put forward a grand challenge on really studying sort of the cancer inequalities question And we were essentially asked to join, the US team came to us to say, because of where you are in London, can we actually join the team? So I think that in itself also adds that people around us are also recognising, and maybe we need to sort of shout that a little bit louder probably, but those are the two that I would say.
That's really good. And again, I'll ask the infrastructure question a little to say, what is it that makes, apart from the population itself, what is it that we do at KHP or across KHP that makes it attractive from that perspective?
Well, I think it's not necessarily, the reality is, I think from my perspective, that unfortunately we don't have the same cancer outcomes for the patient population. So it's not more, it's actually about what we need to do, that there is a need for this work to be done, because you're seeing the same doctors in clinic, but clearly there are differences beyond just the sort of the chemotherapies that you prescribe and things. It could be a lot around the social sort of determinants of the inequalities, but it could also be the biology and things. So I think I would probably frame that as, there's work to be done. We know that it's clearly, there's an issue, but we are probably the right people to be getting involved in that kind of initiative, both. Yeah.
And Ian, you were mentioning the genomics side of that as one of the elements and the World City side of it. Do you want to come in at that point?
Yeah, thanks, Rishi. I mean, I think building on the points colleagues have made, again, we have I would argue, pretty unusual, if not unique, genotype, phenotype distribution in the populations that we serve. But importantly, populations that also have great diversity of equality. And those three axes, I think, are important perhaps to consider. On the genomics piece specifically, I think we're starting to see the benefits of genomic analysis. So, for example, in cancer chemotherapy, the pharmacogenomic analysis of disease susceptibility to certain types of particularly high-cost drugs, we're now starting to see the benefit of that early in the patient pathway rather than later. I think one of the things that we may need to be interested in colleagues' views on this, we've tended to have a sort of medical model of diagnostics, for example, where you start with the simplest and cheapest historically modality of diagnostics, and you save the kind of genomic analysis until the end. The technology now, particularly with things like long-read sequence analysis, really means you could start the genomic analysis at the beginning. I think what's going to be interesting, though, from an economic perspective, is if we're going to do have that type of approach, rather than the traditional model of healthcare innovation adoption, which tends to be one of additionality. You put another layer on top of a multi-layered cake, and it's often a cost cake. I think we need to start thinking about, as you start to put an additional layer on, which might be genomics, it might be another type of precision medicine, how do you take two layers of the cake out so that you go to a lower cost base? And I think that's one of those questions about sustainability. But certainly for the populations that we serve, and we're going to have to think a little bit about which, how do we focus? And I think prostate cancer, for example, in black men in southeast London, there's a particular issue there. We need to start thinking about those three axes and find areas of focus for KHP to have interventions with impact in our local populations.
Okay. I think that's a really it's a really good area for us to focus on. I'm trying to work through, are there good examples of where we might say people who've done part of that journey already across our patch? And I wonder if any of you want to come in with things you've seen that are interesting.
Maybe I don't know if it's necessarily, but I think it's about actually sitting here just looking at, we can't work in solos, and within KHP there is so much. There was a brilliant talk by Rachna about hypertension and things, so we've teamed up, for example, with geriatric team, so oncology, because actually when our patients come in, they might not be going to the GP services, but they have to come in every 3 weeks so we engage with those patients at that time. and similarly the elderly patient population. So actually just having that linkage, that is happening a lot more now, and I think sort of developing on that could probably facilitate a lot of the sort of the cross-cutting, that rather than I'm just doing oncology and that's the cardiologist's problem. Or
and so perhaps fostering those
Yeah.
cross-discipline interactions
Yeah.
is really valuable. And I think on our topic list for today, we did also talk about sort of the academic and commercial partnerships and how we would look across those. You mentioned a big company earlier. I wonder what experience have you all had about working with smaller companies? And AJ, you may also want to come in there.
Sure.
Maybe you come in first and we'll...
Yeah, happy to. Just maybe to touch on the previous point just a little bit, I think, just coming at it from a different angle. You know, one of the things that we're really excited about is how do we get more diverse innovators and entrepreneurs who are going after, you know, challenges that affect their communities. And actually it's a really good way of you know, taking a slightly different approach to solving some of these health disparities that you've talked about. So I just wanted to get that point across, because it's something that
You asked the question.
we're actively...
What would you suggest?
Yeah. What would I suggest?
Yeah.
I think, you know, in my industry, in the venture industry, I think it's, you know, traditionally had a very, it's a politically correct way of saying this. It's had a very, it's had a particular hue that's been, I guess, difficult for diverse entrepreneurs to access. You know, there's a certain social capital that's needed and a lot in accessing venture capital. And I think one of the things that we've done is invest in our teams, and that makes us more accessible to the folks that we're trying to reach in the communities that we're trying to get to. So it's a lot easier for Black entrepreneurs to come and talk to me about their ideas, or we actually have a majority female venture team. It's a lot easier for female entrepreneurs to go and talk to our VCs. So I think there's a little bit of us taking an active approach to being a more diverse organization and attracting more diverse entrepreneurs and innovators. So that's our approach anyway, and we think it works very well.
Thank you. Ian, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point about creating opportunities and a kind of early pipeline for our diverse communities to actually become entrepreneurs. Because there's a political question here as well. I think both likely future governments of either political hue are going to look at this country at generating GDP from technology, science and technology. And both parties, I think, are committed to that future. Trying to find a systematic approach to how we create that thriving economic powerhouse of the future is going to be important. And coming back to your question, Rishi, about spin-ins and spin-outs, we need to foster clearly within the partners of KHP an entrepreneurial mindset where we put the right conditions in place. So, for example, IP rules, data access rules, those sorts of things that foster an entrepreneurial culture. We need to sort of develop those early companies. You know, being a brilliant liver transplant surgeon or a brilliant oncologist, you know, that may not equip someone to be a brilliant business creator. And we need to think about, you know, how do we create those environments? How do we take those companies that are starting? There were some great accelerators in this part of London, Digital Health London, for example, and others. How do we help them up the growth curve? That's the whole point of KHP Ventures and the fund that's been raised to help them actually start to grow. We don't have a great adoption spread model, which is why we really need to work with the HIN and others to work out. We definitely need to think about innovative ways towards accommodating these companies close to us. I think there's a real advantage of proximity. At the moment, we can see our way to a future because of the development opportunities that exist in this part of London, but that large-scale development is a 2029, 30 realization. What are we going to do now that gives opportunities? A number of surveys that colleagues will have seen show that the life sciences industries are still short of occupation space in London. And life sciences companies, whether they're tech or biotech, still want really to be based in it is a golden triangle for a reason. And they want to be down here, but I'd be really interested in your view on that.
Well, just to put some metrics on this, because we recently did an analysis on this, and we found it quite fascinating. So now these are mostly spin-outs that have been in existence for about 4 or 5 years, but the median distance from their host university, this is looking at probably in the region of 100 companies at this point that we were tracking this with. The median distance from the university from which they spun out was 6 kilometers. So it's quite fascinating, and it really buttresses your point around the desire to be around the universities that these innovations spun out of. And even in a more, or the most perhaps mature ecosystem, so we looked at similar data in Boston, and obviously, US much larger scale, and distances don't matter as much as they do here. We're much more parochial in the UK. But even in Boston, the average distance was 60 kilometers, right? So there was, and this is in an ecosystem where there is even less availability of lab space or critical technology development space. So it just goes to show the strength and the pull of the university, and access to talent, access to the research capabilities is so important. So for us, that's why we're so excited to be working with KCL to enable this and to unlock this and to create an environment that allows this to happen.
That's really interesting, and we brought up Kendall Square in Boston a couple of times there. So I think that if we explore a little more about what it is that makes that proximity yield some dividends, both Foad and Sheeba, when we were talking earlier, you talked about working with small companies in an academic setting, or in a clinical setting in your units. I wondered if you'd like to say a little more about what you've done there and how it's worked for you.
Yeah, so in our sort of world of broadly transplantation, sort of liver, kidney, pancreas, there's a huge new sort of technological advances in machine perfusion, so where machines, portable machines, sustain organs in that transit prior to transplantation from the donor to the recipient, and that's a really huge sort of area that's really expanded. It's only really come online in the last sort of probably about 6 or 7 years, and the UK is really one of the leading countries within this. We're in quite a privileged position in South London because not only do we have a big liver unit, we have a big kidney and pancreas unit, only a few miles away, talking about proximity, and actually there are lots of opportunities there to draw in some of the surgical innovations and some of the engineers to come and draw that together. And there's certainly a lot of interest and interactions that we've had from some smaller companies or who are interested in various ways within that technology, either to create parts of machines or create the solutions, for example, that we use. So there's a huge amount of interest there, and we have the patient population, but also the sort of the academic and the clinical talent to be able to partner quite easily with those sort of companies.
I think from an oncology perspective, it's sort of, we've actually done quite well with our own sort of academics who have led a number of spin-outs that have gone on to be very successful. So I'm going to name a few. I think Sophia's one came earlier with her IgE. We've got the CAR T-cell with John Mayer, with Lucid Bio. We also have the gamma delta therapeutics. All of those things have actually, and I think that really, the lab work that we do is actually very much, it's linked to KCL part, so we write grants together. Those things are actually still happening. So in some way, I feel quite sort of lucky that I've kind of come from I do think, if we find something, I should be speaking, and we have just been speaking about that innovation, and should we be thinking, which I don't think 10 years ago we would have been thinking like that as academics. You were like, I've got to just publish this. So I think the mindset has also changed, probably because our sort of the former colleagues have actually shown us that spin-outs, we should be thinking about that, and we've done quite well at King's, I think, specifically in the oncology side, if I sort of look at it, but yeah.
And I think that question about spin-outs is a really interesting one. You've raised that there, and Ian, when he was speaking, I think you were talking about the culture that's changed that's happened there as well. I wonder if any of you want to add to this discussion about sort of what makes that, how we could make that even more successful, or what we do at KHB already that fosters that.
Well, shall I start? I think certainly a permissive environment to start with, but also as you've mentioned, just making sure that we have internal messaging that says actually this is a good thing to do. Yes, of course we publish the paper, but also think about is this something that we could take further. We've got great advantages. We've got a fantastic business school. KCL's business school is fantastic. Are we thinking there are specific programs within the business school on entrepreneurship? Are we making sure that our academics are getting access to the business school, this kind of cross-faculty fertilization? We need to think about how we fund entrepreneurship within KHP. We certainly need to be able to take companies from the sort of sticky, those yellow sticky notes on a wall into a company that has a product. And that's not easy. And then once those companies start, we need to be thoughtful about how we help them grow. The idea of taking large equity shares in founders' companies is not helpful to that company. So we need to think about sensitive ways to do that, and it links back as well to some of the conversation that we had this morning on data. There are companies we can't even imagine yet that will be created in the next decade, particularly based on those developments of the fourth industrial revolution. AI analytics companies, effector arm companies, that issue of actionable insights. There are no real effector arm companies at the moment that can take those insights and then execute at scale. So, how do we create the data sharing environments? We've done very well with the Centre for AI for Value-Based Healthcare in KCL and KHP with the federated learning model. But how do we take that further to create what one might describe as permissive environments rather than restrictive environments for the creation of this type of future value? And just to end on that, Rishi, for me at the moment, but there's been a historical sense that you have to commoditize in a certain way, and commoditization comes, for example, cash value. We need to start thinking much more creatively around value creation, not cash creation, and think collectively how we do that. Because I think if we can create the environment, and of course the great thing about Kendall Square, coming back, is it's an environment where value creation is actually seen as really positive and not something that's a second order activity.
There is actually a question in the Slido from someone in the virtual audience asking where else could we learn from. So we've mentioned Kendall Square, but what other cities or systems are there out there in the world that South East London could learn from?
Well, if I start, but we've got an expert here.
Got a few places, yeah.
If I start in this country, well, colleagues may have seen the pact that was signed at Cambridge this week around the Cambridge cluster. We need to think them, and that's particularly focused on biotech. Oxford clearly has another model. It's entering around the Crick, the Knowledge Quarter, around the Crick, Imperial West. So we've got examples. What do we take from there? But clearly there are global examples as well.
There are. Everyone obviously immediately goes to the U.S. We've talked about Kendall Square. There's also the Bay Area. There's San Diego. There's the sort of North Carolina, Durham triangle. In a European context, there are actually some interesting. I just got back from a trip to Copenhagen, and what's been astounding is the ecosystem development going on over there. A lot of it, truthfully, being driven by Novo Nordisk and the Novo Nordisk Foundation. And I came away from that meeting really, amazed at what they've built in a relatively short period of time, but also thinking, why aren't we doing much more of that over here? We've got two major large pharma companies, just taking a pharmaceutical example, you got two major large pharma companies, GSK and AZ, not necessarily sure they're as active in ecosystem building as Novo Nordisk is in Copenhagen, and it's really starting to pay off dividends over there. So I've been very impressed with that. Other regions in Europe might be Lausanne or Basel in Switzerland. Some really great stuff going on there, and I guess I was at Bio Europe earlier on in the year, and what's been really fascinating is how Europe is really starting to grasp the bull by the horns in terms of creating permissive environments for life science innovation. And maybe just to end myself on this, it's conversations like we had just before we came on the panel in terms of people don't know what they don't know, right? And it's actually only when they're exposed to an environment that allows them to think, okay, is this something that actually takes my fancy and I want to drive forward, that entrepreneurial spark starts to develop. I was telling Sheeba earlier that during my PhD, I was fortunate enough to work in a spin-out for 5 months. Up until then, I didn't know really such things existed in the life sciences sector. And that, essentially completely changed my career trajectory, because I fell in love with it. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is what I want to spend the rest of my life in. So creating that permissive environment that allows people to take different avenues and different paths than perhaps what's been traditional is hugely powerful.
Just to build briefly on that point, I think the other thing, we need to think purposefully within KHP about the conditions for companies large and small at the moment in the commercial world globally. What they really need is a single front door. So coming to a research governance model that's really a single front door, which we should have the opportunity within KHP to create. A single translational medicine offer. A single governance model, because for everyone in this room and online knows that for small and large companies, it's time which is the real factor. So anything that can reduce the time to delivery of a product or a clinical trial is beneficial in commercial terms. So we need to create that, again, a permissive environment to allow delivery faster than we currently do. We also need to find innovative ways. So, for example, with the type of technology that we've invested in, we need to start thinking, how are we going to do digital analysis for particular cohorts for clinical trial. If you look at the O'Shaughnessy report on the future of clinical trial within this country, at the moment we are slipping down the table, and it's mainly about cohort identification and recruitment and time from opening to closure of the trial. And so we need to make ourselves an attractive place to do that type of future research.
I'm so glad you answered that question, because I hadn't asked it, but someone in the audience asked almost exactly that question. So around what could the partnership do to support researchers in order to accelerate this? I think perhaps the question for next year might be around how we help people who are working across KHP understand the journey that they might go through in this type of environment. And you described, AJ, how you learnt about it. I think each of us gets a perspective on it from our area. But I think today's discussion has been fantastic and sets us up really well for the next year and for next year's conference as well. So can I take the opportunity to thank each of you, Foad, Sheeba, AJ, and Ian, for what has been a really stimulating discussion.